Aaron Osmond is our first speaker. He has been serving as a state senator for District 10 since April 2011. Aaron and his wife Nancy and their 5 children live in South Jordan. In his professional life, Aaron is working as the VP, North American Sales for Certiport, which is based in American Fork. It's a high-stakes test development and delivery company serving the academic market. Aaron has demonstrated a willingness to be engaged and accountable to the people of District 10 through regular quarterly meetings, monthly newsletters, and proactive communication about his views on policy issues and upcoming legislation. I specifically asked Aaron to come and speak to us today because he is working on a piece of legislation that, while it may not be everything that I want, it is a step in the right direction, and I just want to preface his remarks with that comment. I'm appreciative of what Aaron's doing, going out on a limb. Some of you have probably seen some of the national media even that have been a little bit ruthless with Aaron, and certainly the local media and others have as well. I think what he's put together is a positive step in moving toward where we need to be, and it's, I think, a good starting point. And so I'd like to turn the time over to Aaron to present this to you.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Can I put this on? Is that okay? I'll just stick it in like this. Okay. Okay, well, like Oak said, this experience over the last 3 months, when I introduced the concept of questioning whether or not we should have compulsory education in our state, has been quite a learning experience. I was not surprised by the level of negative reaction, but I was deeply concerned about the fact that we were in a position where the concern is so great about attendance in public education, where that is the priority, versus the academic outcome and the educational success of our children. It was almost an alarming thing to me when I realized how deep the public education world is seated in this view that a child must come to school, whether or not that they are successful. Now, I understand the context, and in many ways agree that there are those situations where parents really don't care and really are unable to support or even be interested in their child's education. And without some means of ensuring that that child has an option to come to school, they wouldn't have one. That's a sad reality in our society. But I believe that what I want to talk about today is the balance of those two worlds, with the additional insight and focus on what we do when we're in public education, the use of this public resource that is paid for at the expense of the taxpayer. So I hope as we go through this that you will balance in your mind my commitment to ensure parental right to make that choice of the educational pathway of their child, and the need we have in public education to shift the culture of accountability when it comes to parental engagement in that educational pathway. Those are the two worlds I'm trying to balance. And like Oak said, for many of you, I recognize this will not be enough. I get it, I really do. But I believe in the current political environment that we're in today in Utah, that these ideas have meaningful opportunity to pass. And it is a step in the right direction towards educational freedom in our state. And frankly, these ideas are gaining national interest. I have received calls and communications from people outside the state, all over the United States, asking what we're going to do and if we think there's a possibility of passing what I'm about to present to you. So I hope in that context we can have a conversation. You may not agree with everything I'm doing, but hopefully you'll see that we're headed in a good direction. And I'll end my intro with saying this. I still have 2.5 months before the next general session. when these ideas will be presented and communicated to my colleagues. I hope that you will realize I'm serious about the fact that I want your feedback. Most legislators don't present their ideas about a concept or an idea until the general session. I view that together we can achieve a much better legislative outcome if we work together and share with each other our ideas and concerns well before session begins. So with that, let me share with you a few ideas. As I looked at compulsory education, I felt that there were some very significant concerns with this policy approach. One that I don't believe has really been looked at since we implemented compulsory education in our state back in 1890. So I want to share with you these concerns. This is the context behind the challenges I'm trying to solve. And I call them the Big 8 to help us all remember that number, okay? That there are 8 significant challenges I see. The first one, in the premise of compulsory education, the focus is on attendance. It's a hyper-focus on attendance. Now, I recognize that classroom attendance is critical. Participating in the educational process, engaging in education for a child has to happen by attending. I get that. But the focus is on the butt in the seat rather than the achievement of academic success. Do you concur? Okay. Next, if we believe that that's working, then how can we look at our educational outcomes and feel good about it? When you look at our most at-risk students, which frankly are the students that we're so concerned about with compulsory law, we're not succeeding. When you see those results, especially of our English language learners or some of our more economically disadvantaged youth, the ones where homes have challenges, legitimate challenges, and struggle in education, we have nothing to point to say, hey, wow, this is working collectively. Now, there may be individual cases where compulsory education succeeds. I'm aware of many of these examples that teachers have brought to me. One-off scenarios where a child literally was unable to get to school until the school forced the parent to get them there, and once they were there, they succeeded, they prospered, and it made a difference. But those are one-off scenarios. This is a funny graphic, but this is a reality that we're experiencing in our public education system. And let me be clear, this isn't just happening in our Title I schools. This is happening in our affluent schools, where parents are not participating in parent-teacher conference, are not engaging in overseeing what their children are doing in their education, do not feel a sense of responsibility for the education of their children as the primary person responsible for the education of their child. Even in our state statute, everywhere we refer to public education, we talk about the fact that the parent is the primary person responsible for the education of their child. But this is how teachers are feeling across the state. It is kind of funny. Okay, here's the next one. Within the system of public education, we have a challenge with respect for the educator as a professional, not a social worker. We are seeing on a more regular basis parents who are upset when any level of discipline is levied against their child for classroom disruption. It's causing a major problem, not just for the teacher, but for the other kids in that classroom. We have a respect problem, a problem of respect for adults, respect for the educator, respect for the process. And it's causing a major challenge for performance in our classrooms. But they have to be there by law. You follow? The challenge. Another big issue within public education is that we have this system that is fearful of handing out any consequences. If a child is not proficient in public education, especially in elementary school, we say, hey, you better do better, but go on, move on to the next grade. We don't feel good about issuing consequences or holding parents or students accountable because we're nervous about their self-esteem, which is not real world and something that we've created in our culture within public education because of compulsory education. Now here's a big one that's sensitive to many of you. As we look at homeschooling, As a state, because of the concern over compulsory education, we've levied what I believe are unnecessary requirements against the parent. For example, the need for the annual affidavit, the requirement to have a certain number of hours in school, the requirement to follow state curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. I believe these restrictions are unnecessary and often in conflict with how parents feel about the education of their children when they've made the decision to homeschool. We'll talk more about that in a second. Here's a big one in public ed. We have become so hyper-focused as a legislature and as a state board on educator accountability and administrator accountability that we've forgotten that the most critical player that influences the academic success of their children is the parent. In fact, we have a plethora of research that shows that parents have the most significant impact next to a high-qualified teacher on the academic success of their child. But our whole focus legislatively is on holding teachers accountable. Nothing about parents. We'll talk about that. When you have choice, what is the other thing you have? Consequences. When you have choice, you have consequences. One without the other cannot exist. It's a natural law, but we've created that in public education. The last piece is relative to compulsory education. You may not see the connection immediately, but it's there. We have a state requirement that says that our children must be in school for 180 days, for 990 hours, as an obligation on our school system. That somehow we've equated that 990 hours equals academic success. Think about that. We know that that's not true, that students can succeed without sitting in a classroom. That in fact many of our students can test out and pass out of classes that they don't even have to attend. But we don't allow for that in our education system because we're so concerned about attendance and the time of, and excuse me, but the butt in the seat again is more important than the outcome. So we've got to address these challenges, and I believe I have a solution that it can be articulated in 3 separate pieces of legislation. Now, at the request of many that I've worked with, including Oak and great people in different organizations, I've broken these ideas into 3 pieces of legislation because, frankly, there are some pieces that people like and some people that don't. And they're broken up so that in case one doesn't pass or does pass, it doesn't affect the whole legislation. We've broken them up into 3 separate bills. One is parental freedom to choose an educational pathway. That's bill number 1. Bill number 2 is about parent choice and accountability in public education. And bill number 3 is about enabling local control of classroom time. And I'll explain each one of these as we go through. So, under the first bill, I want to come back to our code and reinforce 2 important things. One, that we as a society believe that the education of our child is extremely important. So we want to know from every parent what their decision is relative to the educational pathway that they get to choose. So we want to reinforce education is important for every child and they get to choose the educational pathway of their child. Now that doesn't exist today in code. So what we're suggesting is that it become law that a parent make that decision and notify their local school district of their decision one time, not every year. So when a child is 6 years of age, which is stated in statute as the age of eligibility for education, that we're going to tell the state, hey, we're going to make a choice between homeschool, private school, or public school. And in some cases, dual enrollment. Now, what we're going to change in the statute is to say, hey, when I make the decision to choose homeschool or private school, I then take the full responsibility of the education of my child upon myself. And I ask the state to get out of my way permanently. So what we're saying here is the parent's going to sign a one-time affidavit up to that point. And the key part here is that it is reinforced that the parent has the primary responsibility for the oversight of the education of their children without interference from the state in any way. So what does that mean? It means that the parent will now have the option, the right, to be able to use any curriculum that they so desire, to have the educational classroom time schedule at their decision and recommendation, to have the freedom to do what they want to do from an educational perspective without statutory interference from the state or from the Board of Education. Can I get to questions after? I just write it down to make sure. I just want to be able to get through this in time. And the last piece is you as parents will have the right to restrict all information about your child from any state data source, any federal information, any special interest group. You'll be able to block that completely under this statutory change. Now, with choice comes accountability. One of the challenges that we hear about from public education relative to homeschool, and sometimes even private school, is that it isn't done well. And then the parent is overwhelmed and brings their child back to public education with a significant disparity from an educational status perspective between that child and the rest of the kids in their class. That's a problem. There has to be accountability with choice. And if you make the choice to bring your child back to public education, then there's going to be an age-appropriate assessment that's done. The child is going to get placed in the grade level that best matches their academic capability. And there is the possibility under this statute that a parent will have to pay for the cost of remediation to bring that child through tutoring or summer school up to speed with their peers if they're behind. Now, the reality is that for most of you, your child is way ahead of where most kids are in public education. That won't be a problem. But what this is there for is to remind parents, you are responsible for the education of your child. This is not just an easy out. If you want to bring them back into the public resource, which is paid by public taxpayers, then you have to make sure your child is at or above peer level, or you could have some consequences. All right, let's move on now to when the parent makes the choice to use public education as their resource. Now again, let's consider this. Public education is funded at the expense of the taxpayer. Public education is not free. It costs billions of dollars that we all pay for. So it's time for some accountability when we use that resource. The first step to achieving that is that, like when you all sign an affidavit for homeschool, they are going to sign a contract, a public education participation contract. Now, just for context, we already do this today in most of our charter schools. Parents sign this kind of agreement now. It's very similar to what I'm about to share with you. When they sign this agreement, these are the things that they're going to agree to do. Maybe for some of you this seems like it's onerous, but the reality is that this is an important mental shift, a cultural shift about the attitude of the use of public education when I, as a parent, enroll my child. First, I agree to support the local district attendance policies. I'm not suggesting anything about the state. The local school district attendance policies, where my local school board meets with me and we make those decisions about what those policies should be as a parent, hopefully. Second, that I recognize that my teacher is a professional. That's the assumption I'm coming in with. And that they have to administer classroom discipline. What's so stunning is that parents are so upset when any level of discipline is levied against their child. We have to shift that culture and recognize that the teacher has to have classroom discipline to succeed in education, and that we support them. Next, that we will attend all parent-teacher conferences. That will be a requirement, not an option. We are expecting parents to engage in their child's education and to know what's happening when they make that choice, again, to use the resource of public education. Finally, that they understand it is their responsibility to support their child in homework. And guess what? It is hard. And yes, you're busy. We all are. Some of us are more affluent than others. Some of us have 2 or 3 jobs. I get that. But you chose to be a parent, you chose to have a child. You are responsible for the education of that child as the primary responsible person. The state is the secondary responsible organization. So you are agreeing to support your child in their homework. And then third, or last, if the child fails, if they require remediation, they will be required to have it. Whether that be summer school or tutoring, we're going to say to all parents statewide, remediation is required. We won't just allow the child to move on to the next year without something in between. And you as a parent may be responsible for all or part of the cost of that remediation. That is big. And I'll tell you right now, that will be a big, big battle for me, especially from the advocates of the poor. Now, I believe that you have to take into consideration the financial realities of the child and the parent. But a parent can afford something, even if it's $1 or $5. There has to be skin in the game and an understanding that we share this together. Now, some will ask me, well, how do we know that it was the child's fault or the parent's fault? Why isn't it just the educator's fault, that they were a bad teacher? True. But won't you have plenty of time to figure that out throughout the school year if you're attending parent-teacher conferences and fulfilling your obligations under the parent or the public education participation contract? You will know. And the pathway to addressing that challenge is you've got to have some kind of arbitration path through the truancy court if necessary. But the key here, guys, is where there's choice, there's accountability. Where there's choice, there's accountability. Now, with accountability, there has to be choice. One of the challenges we have in public education is that we really don't know what our rights are. Oftentimes, we feel like we're subservient to the school system. That has to change. Now, that's going to be just as hard. They're so used to compulsory education saying your child must be there and your child must do what I say, that it's difficult to shift the culture to think, oh, I actually am supporting the client. The student is my customer. The parent is my customer. I'm there to help them succeed as the primary person responsible for the education of their child. So, here are your rights that we want to start articulating. These are the few that we believe are the most important, but there may be other ones that we'll add between now and session. The first one is, as a parent, I get to decide. I get to have the reasonable accommodation to decide if my child is mature enough to go on to the next grade. I have the right to influence the selection of my teacher for my child. I have the right to authorize excused absences for my family without the need of a medical professional giving me their signature, because I am the most important authorization. I have the right to have flexible options relative to parent-teacher conferences so that I can meet my obligation under my contract. And finally, I have the right to expect that my child can test out of the subjects that they know so my child can graduate early if they so desire. Now again, these are big. This is massive change, and it's tough under the context of reasonable accommodation, not expectation. There are going to be situations where those accommodations aren't possible, where a teacher that you want simply, we can't add another student in the classroom. But you have the right to these expectations with reasonable accommodation. That's part of the total plan. So, what can the state really do when I've chosen to use public education as my educational resource? How do they actually hold me accountable? Current compulsory law identifies that path. But now it's restricted to those that make the choice of public education as their educational pathway. So these are the two areas when I can be held accountable. A, I fail to select an educational pathway for my child. And B, I fail to fulfill the obligations I have under my public education participation agreement. What the school district can then do is notice you, bring you into the office, have a discussion. If you don't agree, it can be remanded to truancy court. You can figure it out with a judge, just like today. But the difference is you made the choice to use public education. You signed that contract. You agreed to use that resource and fulfill certain obligations. Now you have choice with accountability. That is natural law from my perspective. Now let's talk about a student's failure. Students today, there are accountability measures in the context of a grade. They know when they succeed and fail, but there's really not any accountability to what do you do if that happens. Again, the only thing that I'm suggesting that we have different as a major change is a student will be required to attend summer school or have tutoring, and that the parent will be responsible for all or part of that cost. That is the accountability measure. Now, the clear exception to that are children with disabilities. It's unacceptable to put a parent in that position when they cannot control, when a child is legitimately disabled or having challenges that require special support. And that is the purpose of special education resources in the state. All right, so that's Bill 2. Let's move on to Bill number 3. Again, I believe that it's important that we have local control within the public education system. The best local control is the parent themselves. Within public education, the best local control is still the parent. That's the cultural shift I'm trying to reinforce. But within that school system, the school board must make decisions about how to manage the resource of public education. And I believe that we need to empower and reinforce their role and authority. You'll see a different bill from me this year relative to reinforcing school board authority for their fiduciary and legislative responsibility, ensuring that that is not passed off to the staff, and then holding staff accountable when they fail to provide the local school board with the financial and operational information they need to make the right decisions. That's a whole separate bill I'm working on this year. It's going to be big and fought hard, I'm sure. But in this case of local control, I believe that we need to repeal the 990-hour, 180-day requirement. And just so you know, the State Office of Education actually agrees with me. I know it's stunning. But they think that it is time to let that decision be had. Now, they want to have some governance over it, not allow anything below a certain number, but we're working through that. I'm really impressed, though, that they get that this is important. Now we can enable our local school districts with the option of deciding what is the best balance between teacher preparation time, teacher development time, classroom time, and the ability for the student to pass out of the classes they want to pass out of. That classroom time isn't the critical factor, it's a factor, and let them come up with that solution. It empowers them in a way that, in my mind, will allow us to start focusing on outcomes instead of attendance. So those are my 3 pieces of legislation. Greater parental right in choosing the educational pathway of their child, more flexibility for homeschoolers and private schoolers, and greater accountability for parents when using the resource of public education, along with additional choice and rights for them. And then finally, more local control relative to the use of classroom time and classroom, seat time in the school system. I believe that this combination of bills achieves the following. It respects the parent's primary responsibility for the education of their child. It reinforces that education is important to our state, that we hope and expect that every child will be educated for the preservation of our constitutional freedom that we enjoy and for the future economic prosperity of our state. And that we recognize that when we provide access to public resources like education, that there has to be accountability. I believe that those principles are balanced in these pieces of legislation. Now, you may not agree with everything that I'm suggesting. You may think that it's harsh or that we shouldn't put these kinds of requirements on parents. Let's debate it. Let's discuss it. That's what great public policy is about. I hope that you'll join with me in having that dialogue And even if we can't agree or don't agree on every policy issue, hopefully we agree on more things together than we disagree on. And with that, I want to thank you for your time and open it up right now for, how much time do I have? 15? Excellent. Some time for some questions. Yes? Well said. So let me just repeat for the video. The question is, would I be willing to offer debate sessions or comment sessions where we could get into more details together in a different setting? I would do that. I will welcome that opportunity. We'll set up a couple between now and January. I will do it through this handsome gentleman right here. Well, handsome might be questionable, but this is a great guy. No, I will do that. I think that's a great idea, and I ought to do that in different parts of the state between now and the time that we get to session. I will do that. Thank you. I saw a hand over there, then we'll come over here. Well, the answer is no. We don't have control over the state board, and we don't have control over the locally elected officials either. We do have influence, and we can, through statutory changes, make them do certain things. We can. But I think that just to repeat your question is, will we as a legislature be able to control how the State Board of Education and our local boards respond to legislation like this, and maybe make their own requirements that make it more difficult for parents within public education? Is that a good summary? Here's my view. First of all, I believe that this piece of legislation reinforces the rights of parents, gives them more control over the outcomes, and causes local school boards and the state board to reconsider their decisions in the context of local control and parental right. That's the right cultural shift. But we will have battles on this topic. There's no doubt about it. And often you have to remember, too, that many graduation requirements are left up to the local school districts. They're not often even the state board that make those decisions. All right. Well, we have a challenge. One of the biggest challenges that we have in Utah, from my perspective, is the governance issue of public education. Where the authority really lies to make the decisions and who we empower with that authority to do so. So I want you to know we get that. We're working through those issues. But I think this is a step in the right direction to addressing some of your concerns. But certainly the battles will not end here on this front line. There was a woman here, and then we'll come over here. Go ahead. Are you asking that question of what is the right outcome from a parent's perspective? Do we have that standardized? Okay, so are you I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. Are you asking? Culturally. That is a very deep question. Yes, ma'am, and I don't challenge the importance of what you said. I don't have an answer to that. So the question was, how do we know when we've arrived from an educational output perspective? What is the right educational requirements or outcome for our kids? Is that accurate? I honestly, yeah, it's seat time. Yeah, that's the answer. Well, truthfully, the intent behind this legislation relative to that question is that there isn't one outcome, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all, that there is no predefined end game, that every child's different and every family's different, and that we have to empower the family and the child to pursue the educational path that they want. But that we recognize education is important. So that's all that this suggests, and I want to be really clear to everyone in this room. I am not an educational expert. I was never trained in public ed or educational theory or anything. I just care, as a parent and a policymaker, that we enable as much choice and flexibility as possible in our education system. So let's go to this woman here, and then we'll come up here, and then over to there in the back. Okay, so the question was, or really more of a statement, we need to abolish the State Board of Education. Can we do that? So let me just talk to that. Let me just talk to that for just a second. The State Board of Education is a constitutionally mandated governance board. It wasn't new. It was established when we defined and founded the state of Utah. We created this. Now the politics behind it can be questioned. What happened then and why it happened in other states. But you need to know that the legislature is concerned about governance of public education and the role of the state board and the legislature. They're concerned about the local school board authority and decision-making parameters. They're concerned about the politics and the policy issues. And there has been more conversation since I've gone into the legislature, not because of me, but since I've been there, about this topic than any other time in our history. So I anticipate seeing legislation around governance and suggestions and ideas just like what you proposed, and other ones, to improve governance in public ed. All right, let's come up here. Well, the challenge that let me repeat your question. The question was, with the implementation of Common Core from the state, could we see local districts actually increase the amount of time in the seat versus decrease it because of the rigor placed on them because of Common Core? My view of that is no, because of the cost. We're not increasing with this plan budget for them to increase the number of days. And so it would be very challenging for them to be able to afford that. I believe what you'll see, though, is a recognition that their teachers are struggling. They're not prepared. And they need more time to be able to get educated themselves and to prepare for classroom because of some of those challenges. Now, I frankly believe this bill flies in the face of Common Core because it allows for so much more local control and parental involvement. It also allows parents at home to no longer worry about whether or not Common Core does or does not gain hold. They're no longer obligated to have any state curriculum at all. That's a big, big change. You won't have any affidavit that you have to sign that says, I will follow the state curriculum. So just keep that context in mind, but I don't see that being a problem going the other way because of funding more than anything else. Yes, ma'am, in the back. So the question is, do I believe, well, let me first of all restate for the record what you were saying, that you believe that the local control piece is more of an appeasement, it's not really real change. That you see that the change is much greater that is needed on a local control basis, specifically when it comes to curriculum. And I appreciate that, I really do. Like Oak was talking about earlier, there's a lot more that we could be doing, a lot more that we could try to change. But we also have to look at the reality of the political environment that we're in. And I believe it's important to push change and do it regularly, but do it in a way where we can actually make progress and not just create a fight. So we have to look at that and say, yes, this is headed in the right direction. But will it really make a difference in local control of curriculum, for example? I believe that it will. And let me just give you some context from a national perspective. Some of you may know this, some of you may not. From a national view, the Common Core, the concept of the Common Core is being battled in almost every single state, liberal and conservative. This battle is real, and it's about local control, not just from the state board, but from the federal government. The overreach of the federal government is astounding. For example, they are trying to fund monies directly to the local school districts, bypassing the state Board of Education, bypassing the local districts, going directly to the schools to get them to commit to certain programs for access to funding. This is a battlefront that we're on. There's no doubt about it, and it's about local control. And every step we make to reinforce that, in my opinion, is a very positive step in the right direction. Somewhere over here. Yes, ma'am.
My question is,
yeah, so today, truancy court is administered at the district court level. It's part of their responsibilities. And often, it's not always used, it's rarely used, it's not something that happens all the time, but when it does come up that level, it has a cost, there's no doubt about it. It's in the neighborhood of several $1 million right now statewide when that happens. What I'm trying to work on in this piece of legislation is to limit what that court can do by making it relevant to the education of their child. So for example, about a year or two ago, we had a situation down in Utah County with a woman and her daughter where the truancy court found that the child's use of makeup was the reason why she wasn't coming to school, and therefore remanded a judgment to the parent and to the child that they could not use makeup anymore. Seriously, that happened here in Utah County. That is a problem from a freedom perspective. And so we're working to limit those types of scenarios. But I believe that the importance of the truancy court, though, is that they have to be able to stand back and look at the parent's view under that parental participation contract, the school's view, and decide who really is at fault here. Because if it's just up to the school, you could have scenarios where the school decides we're just going to push back because we want more money. We want to force parents to pay, rather than they're not doing their job and they haven't fulfilled their obligations. So it's a balance. And we're looking at what that increased cost might be if we see these types of cases roll up. I don't know that answer yet. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
I love the
So let me just restate for the record so that the idea is it's great that we're holding parents accountable, but many times parents are not equipped themselves to handle some of the responsibilities that they have. We have to accept that reality, guys. While we would love to say that parents are responsible and they own their decisions, they also need some support. A great example of that is found at West High School, where we have a parent facility there that they can come into and receive support and training about how to effectively work with their child in the education system. That doesn't exist in many other locations in our state. It's unique to that location because of the high volume of at-risk kids in that particular school. But I agree that that's something that we really have to address. How much time do I have, Vogt? 5 minutes? Okay. Let's come back here. I think you bring up a really valid point, is that the pressure that's being placed on the system relative to Common Core is causing behaviors in teachers and kids that parents don't know how to respond to or even engage in, and you're even feeling like you're being pushed out of the system because of it. And I think I've talked to many teachers who feel completely overwhelmed with this, unsure how to handle it themselves. And I think that's an issue, systemic issue. Now, I didn't mean my presentation to be about the Common Core, but let me just address this question. I believe under the parental rights section of this bill that we ought to be evaluating something relative to this issue. The right of the parent to know and understand the curriculum requirements and be able to engage with the parent on how to modify them for the benefit of their child. I think we have to look at that. Now, I don't know exactly what that will mean or how we do it, but you bring up a really valid point. Okay, let's do 3 more questions. One more question. Well, let me address the first one. I may only be able to get to that one, and maybe you and I can talk after on the second one. I do recognize that unique challenge. One of the reasons why I put the accountability on the parent for public education, if they choose or wind up having to re-enroll their child back in public education, that they may have a cost associated with their failure to educate their child, is for one of those reasons, because we recognize we don't want this system to force parents to choose homeschooling because it's just too much work to deal with public school. Follow? Now, we have that challenge. We're trying to work through some of those dynamics. That's a major issue as part of this policy. The other issue is poverty and the cost issue. Again, my goal is to leave up to the local school district but require that they do have to take into consideration the financial realities of that parent. Like I said earlier, $5 may be all that is needed to reinforce that that parent has an accountability, but there must be skin in the game. And I recognize that there are some unique challenges associated with that. And we're going to have to work through that from a policy perspective. Let me just finish with this. I am honored to have the opportunity to serve in this role. I recognize that I don't know everything and that I have made mistakes and I will probably make more mistakes. But I hope that through accountability, by having these kinds of conversations and being engaged with the people that are affected by what I do, that I'll be a part of bringing good policy to the state with you. We own this together. This isn't just on the legislature. This is on all of us. We've got to work together. We've got to be clear on our opinions. And then we may not always agree, but let's try and make some progress to solve the problems we face. And with that, I thank you very much for your time.